Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in for another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norrid, Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with academics, faith leaders, and social justice practitioners to talk about the intersections of faith, climate change, and the social justice issues of our time. And this morning, I have on a very, very, very good friend and an important guest here, Khalfani Lawson. A
Peace.
co-laborer through grad school together, and I'm very grateful to have Khalfani here. Khalfani is the Associate Director of Student Life and International Student Advisor here at Columbia Theological Seminary. Khalfani, thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, man, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Cody, and I'm grateful for all the work you're doing and all the work that Gipple's doing. So.
Thanks, man. Well, tell us, before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you kind of come to the work of theology and the work of social justice.
So, I mean, a common fact that for whatever reason people find interesting. I'm from Atlanta, born and raised, and currently reside in Atlanta, specifically East Atlanta, and then have gradually kind of just moved further out. But recently, my wife and I have moved to the West Side, and we're really enjoying it. But I mentioned where I live, though, because, for me personally, sociality, like you have to talk about, when you talk about social justice, you have to unpack what does it mean to be social. And that Atlanta is a rich city with rich traditions, and specifically very rich Black traditions. And, what you can't find where I'm from on the east side of Atlanta anymore is very much present on the west side. Due to gentrification, so on and so forth. But in terms of social justice, I've just grown up in an incredibly pro-Black, very diverse theological kind of home, hence my name. And so thinking critically about sociality, justice, being the son of two police officers by career, these are things that have always been kind of a question for me, and very important to unpack and kind of be in conversation with people about it. So, yeah, that's who I am, and I mean it structures my work in a lot of ways. So,
yeah, I appreciate that, and I think you lifting up that a primary piece of environmental ethics is to talk about where the place in which you're rooted, right? You can't
Precisely.
do ethics without talking about the place in which you're rooted, which West Atlanta
Yep.
and Atlanta for a long time, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you tell us, you have a reading to offer, but before you offer that, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about your religious tradition and, where you come from and how your religious tradition helps you see kind of the work of environmental justice and all these other intersecting social issues.
Cody, that's a great question. As best as I can put it, my religious background is I'd say calculated amalgamations. So this like mixture, I don't want to say gumbo, but with my mother and father, coming from, Christian households, I come from this kind of Baptist Costal tradition on one hand. Mm-hmm. And on that hand, there's a finger that's very much steeped in the, what'd you call it? Prosperity gospel. So I grew up in New Birth Missionary Baptist Church on one hand. And so on the other, I went to First African Presbyterian out in Lithonia, again, being from a very pro-Black home. And along with that, African religious traditions such as Ifa were very prominent in, my childhood. My goodness. And because of the nature of my father's work as a semi-politician, we found ourselves in the ways that Black people do religion. We found ourselves in somebody's masjid, oftentimes very close, working with Atlanta Masjid. And so, yeah, I mean, in a way, man, thinking about Blackness, there's something about Blackness for me that kind of goes beyond within and beyond what we think of about as concrete faith traditions, ecumenical, but also multi-faith. So yeah, I come from all of these. And again, it informs who I am at present and what I do
Yeah.
and how I pray.
Well,
So
I definitely want to dive into that more, but I'll let you offer up your reading and we'll dive in.
for sure. Yeah, so about this reading, you know, in 2016, of course, there was a lot going on in the wake of Ferguson. And I say in the wake in particular because at that time I was planning to leave the country for a year to do study in Germany. And, you know, by happenstance, I was on academia.edu and I came across an essay from Christina Sharp, who at the time was at Tufts, but now she's forget what institution in Canada, but what's important is the work is entitled In the Wake on Blackness and Being. And I encourage all to read the text in full, but there was a quote I wanted to lift up in particular, and it's on page 7. And it reads as follows. The ongoing state-sanctioned legal and extra-legal murders of Black people are normative and, for this so-called democracy, necessary. It is the ground we walk on, and that it is the ground lays out that and perhaps how we might begin to live in relation to this requirement for our death. What kinds of possibilities for rupture might be opened up? What happens when we proceed as if we know this anti-Blackness to be the ground on which we stand, the ground from which we attempt to speak, for instance, in I or we who know, in I or we who care. And that's from Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, page 7, which came out in 2016. And yeah, that is the reading I'd like to offer.
Yeah, talk a little bit about why you chose that reading and what's important about it to you.
Frankly, in the wake is useful language. And in order to try and make something that looks like sense of anti-Black violence, you know, you have our more popular situations like Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor. And so in trying to make sense of those things, like how does that happen? Like what does justice look like? And so thinking about the Odyssey some, right? Like, and what does God have to say about evil in the world? Christina Sharp kind of, frankly, for me in that work, but I mean, out of that quote, but out of that work, she really, along with others, which we can talk about, she, for the first time for me, she was the first person that had actually looked at the calculus of anti-Black violence and gone, what if that is the land? So as opposed to treating it as if, okay, someone was murdered and their body was left out in the street as a spectacle. Like, and again, we have a history of these things. What happens if we treat that as it presents itself, which is the violence that is the lay of the land. So there's something about anti-Black violence that breaks down this kind of grammar that I'm used to hearing, you know, say Black life matters, right? And what I was trying to figure out and what Christina Sharp's work made possible for me was to figure out, okay, how is it exactly that Black life has mattered and does matter in an anti-Black project, such as the one that we're currently in? And so, and my thinking is that if we're able to look that in all of its terror, in all of its all of the terrible things that looking at it would suggest as it is, that we might be able to find something that looks like an otherwise or an hereafter, so to speak. So yeah, it came out of survival, but also a need for an otherwise, really, Cody.
Yeah.
And there's also ecological things
Yeah.
at the core as well. But yeah, that's a
no, you saying lay of the land kind of makes me think about you know, violence done to Black bodies throughout the history of the American project and beyond that, but specifically kind of a lot of work done to link that with ecology. So similar to Cain and Abel stories, like the land itself is soaked in blood, yep. And that in and of itself kind of breaks the covenant. And then there's the other piece of that, which is, and then in spite of that, or in addition to that, then we also further harm the land. And so I was curious if you had any riffings on that or how those things maybe connect to you when you were laying that out, because I know that you have something there.
Being completely honest, the missus and I were just talking yesterday about land. Again, starting from, what we're currently dealing with, there's COVID to be sure, but as I mentioned, we're blessed to have bought our first home. However, all of the processes that go into purchasing a home, such as a survey of the land, the inspection, there's all of this kind of calculus that's involved with the property value, the history of the values, the people that occupied the land prior. There's the way the neighborhood moves, right? Like the idea that one needs to have a radon test done because a common practice way back when, Atlanta was more industrial, it's at 40, 50 feet below the soil, there might be buried substances, right? Like there's all these things that come up out of home ownership, but primarily kind of getting a little more heady for me. When we talk with Christina Sharp talks about kind of a climate, not the weather, but the climate of anti-Blackness. That includes kind of an ecological assertion. And so this idea that the land is primarily for the services of capital, right? That it is primarily for all of the things that capital needs. And when I say capital, I say that keeping in mind that there were people who arrived as capital, right? And so for all of the things that are built around the service of capital on the land, it ultimately does violence against the land, right? And so again, we can dig into that some more, but no, there's the world is at the core of all of this. And nobody survives it,
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, what capital needs will run our resources to the ground, frankly.
Right. Well, it strikes me the way that you're kind of talking about the climate of anti-Blackness, and in particular, kind of how Black bodies kind of get codified as a resource, right? And I was thinking about kind of the way you mine up creation as a resource, and similarly, you mine up, Black communities, African American communities, communities of color, Indigenous communities. Pick your like non-white community that you want to grind up as a resource, and how the similar reframings about what it takes to be in right relationship with the land or with creation, and how some of those things map onto how you change the systems that we see, right? So systems, not only to be in right relationship, but how we kind of prop up these systems of injustice or extractive industries, which we normally think about in relationship to the land, but also there's obviously extractive industries that apply on to people groups, and how those things are related.
I like the work that extraction it does. What you mentioned, that's what it is. It's extraction, and for what purpose? I literally just preached 2 weeks ago about the Tower of Babel, right? And how there's this kind of like anti-God, idolatrous kind of thing that takes place in extraction, which takes all the things crafted. If one looks at it from a Christological, like from a Christian perspective,
Sure.
you take all the things out of God's image made, that God created over those 7 days, and you extract out of them something for your purposes, not keeping in mind the longevity, or at least honoring what it is that was laid before you. And so I'm thinking about extraction and my mind's running at like 200 miles an hour.
Good. Well, I'll get that out of you at some point.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, so you had sent me a reading by Brand, which I'll invite you to talk a little bit about, but in that reading, he talks about kind of the push against the return to normal. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, I believe the reading is called The Calculus of Living and Dying. If you could talk a little bit about that work and maybe Brand's work, and then kind of this invitation or suggestion or commission to push against the return to normal.
Yeah. I mean, our entire world, or put differently, a entire world that takes place on top of the world has been kind of thrown into what some see as chaos, right? Because of COVID-19. And, specifically for us, we think about, the shifts that have had to been made because of work, right? Like I'm unable to get in my car, drive to campus, and be in close proximity with one another. I'm unable to get in my car and go to the grocery store safely because there is a biological threat. And in some cases, folks were able to get in the car, go to a particular place, but then you start to think about how the realm of the political has always already structured how we move. And so like what Brand, again, like go find Christina Sharp's work and just get lost in it. But to be frank, I came to learn about Dion Brand from Christina Sharp. So she has a verso, a poem.
We'll put links to these works.
Down
below this video. So if you're watching this work, definitely get a hold of these books.
Yeah. But and I was sent this article just released in midsummer, last summer, which, wow, thinking about where we are now.
It's a decade ago now.
Yeah. Right. All the things that happened in 6 months in 2020, but you've heard it. I've heard it. There's this push to the kind of return to normal, right? Can
we get back to the way things
I
were?
can't wait until we can, gather in the way that we could last February, right? Like I can't wait until I can go to the store and can, just continue these things that have been placed on pause. And frankly, what Brand does is just, I mean, again, it's brilliant, but it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, duh. Like we know that, all of the like it brings into question what was normal again, like, right? Like, she asks, was the violence against women normal? Which it was. What was anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism normal? It was. And so what Brand does is she really pulls this all incredible, all normal phrase that we're using, normality, the destination that we're trying to get to, and she unpacks it from all kinds of different registers. Again, Blackness, indigeneity, ecologically even, right? What has been the impact of, folks staying at home more often?
Right.
Homelessness, right? Like,
right.
Transphobia, homophobia, like what is the normal that we're trying to get back to? And so COVID has both ruptured this sense of normality, but it's also laid bare what we mean. If we're willing to look at it, it lays bare what normality is, right? And so honestly, if we sit with that question, what is normal? My hope, I wouldn't bet on it, but we might be able to restructure a normality that is less subtended by, and that needs violence against certain persons or non-persons, right? So which is just an invitation to live differently and live lighter in the world, with and for each other. And so yeah, I mean, again, Brand, I can't do it justice. Go read it.
Well, you also lift up, I mean, so this probably intersects with exactly what you just said and some of the discussion that you were offering earlier on kind of the anti-Black world in which we live. But Brand also lifts up kind of framings of capital and oppressive injustice. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, how that's related to policing and to governance, and some of the ways that they discuss it in the work, but also a lot has happened in pandemic times.
And so capital, policing, you know, and just I'm trying to remember his name. It escapes me. But there are some, and again, I come from a very pro-Black household, and as a consequence, you know, I grew up attending lectures and so on and so forth. But I know you can find on Dead Prez's album, I can't remember the name of it, it's escaping me, but the quote, and I'll find it for you. The quote is, you have at the emergence of the haves and the have-nots the need for policing, right? And again, you know, I wear my father's rings. One of the more prominent ones is, well, the scales of justice have broken off of it, and I've opted to not have them fixed. But this is his Atlanta police ring from 1973. But there's this interesting intersection of, again, non-whiteness and policing, right? And all of the things that took place in the city of Atlanta, Cody, in the, you know, mid early 90s, in preparation for the Olympics, right? You had you had places like Little Five Points, East Atlanta Village, you know, where Ponce crosses and where it turns in, well, Moreland goes north and it turns into Briarcliff, but all of that stuff south was completely Black. No one wanted anything. Well, there was a point at which it was all white, but prior to the current shift, it was Black. And Cody, they cleared the land, and that was done through policing. That was done, you know, through systematic kind of underserving people through jobs. If you had a felony, you could not receive public housing benefits. And then they also got rid of public housing. Atlanta's the first city to do this in the country. And so they moved these Negroes out of here and they cleared it out. And now you have, in a place where, you know, I grew up in homes at $50,000, $60,000. They're worth, I just saw condos, Cody, that were $500,000. And so, yeah, I mean, policing has a surveillance function. It has a function of serving the haves. And frankly, in terms of anti-Blackness, which is usually my framework that I'm thinking from, policing, blueness is not an ontological category. It is it is a job that one opts into, right? And that job
and can just as easily opt out of.
Precisely, you know? Because my Black parents who were police definitely told me about all of their racist coworkers, and they would explain to me that this is what my colleagues are looking for when they're pulling folks over. Don't do that. Right. And however, you can be both Black and at the service of white supremacy, capitalism, etc. Like one can be wholly involved. And to be frank, we're all involved. But kind of what Christina Sharp was getting at earlier, we have to find places for rupture, right? And I don't know what that looks like, but I mean, just loosely, those are my thoughts on policing. But
yeah, well, I was going to ask you, I mean, so I think what you brought up just now is incredibly helpful because, sometimes what I hope everyone who's watching is seeing is, we've done a lot of talk about environmental injustice, and we talk a lot about how kind of communities of color, Black communities, experience the brunt of environmental injustices and the brunt of energy burden and energy inequities and things like that. But what you help just highlight now is, I think, tying sort of environmental theology and morals to how we displace people. And that actually, obviously America has a history of displacing Native peoples. That's part of our story. We push people out of land. But I think even looking at how we do it now, that it's why gentrification is actually also theologically an environmental concern, because we are pushing people off their land. It's another, how does land intersect with some of those decisions? And so I appreciate kind of like the teasing out of the intersections between racist policies, however they manifest, and how those generally intersect with how we treat the land and how it's bound up in how we treat the land one way or the other. So I do appreciate that. I was going to ask you, as you think about environmental concerns, but also other kind of concerns that relate, what are the rupture points that you see, and what are you hoping for congregations to look at? And, you're in a position where you get to lead students in higher education in a variety of forms, and kind of what's your hope for the theologically curious, for the faith leader, for the congregation, for the student? What are the rupture points that how do we make ourselves attuned to what those points might even be?
And so I had a hope at one point to do something like the Philadelphia Negro, like Du Bois's text from the early 1900s about Atlanta. But so we'll see. But what's important about that, Cody, is in the footnotes, buried in the footnotes in the Philadelphia Negro from Du Bois, so what he's doing in Philadelphia Negro, he's doing what's some consider the first sociological study of the city of Philadelphia, of Black people's conditions. And what was different about it was that he treated them as the subjects of study, right? Like, so he was treating them as if they were human beings, and he was studying the conditions in which they live, as opposed to treating them as kind of the metonym for all things bad that previous scholarship had done about Black people and Black living and Black life. But in the footnotes, he goes through all these laws in Philadelphia's books, and one of the things that emerges is really interesting is this idea of a tumultuous gathering. And so the idea was that two Black folks, it was illegal for two Black folks without the presence of a white person be present. So two Black people gathering, right? Like that is a tumultuous gathering, right? And so it makes me think about tumultuous gathering, right? Like what is the thing that folks are afraid of? Or what is it about law that needs to structure the way in which Black folks gather? Like what? And just thinking in that space, I think about tumultuous gatherings often. And for theological education, especially amongst non-white persons, non-heteronormative persons, I think we are in need of more tumultuous gatherings, more meetings by water coolers, more the phrase doesn't land in the way that I want it to, but so I won't use it. That's a conversation for later. But frankly, theology, the language, the grammars available to us in these institutions, it gives us the language to kind of unpack what I consider to be the idolatrous construct of white supremacy. And again, I mentioned earlier this idea of the Tower of Babel, Cody. I do consider white supremacy, or white, and frankly, I would even consider white being, right? All things that are that subtend white being, and all of the serviceable others that are used to kind of structure white being. We have to unpack these things. And if you're a Christian and if Christ died for you, why do non-white people need to continue dying for you, right? For capital, for this myth that we live in, which is, how did this happen here? It usually happens there, right? Thinking of January 6th. So we have to there's a myth, right? There's a myth. There's a myth of the normal and all the things that come with it. And theology, theological institutions give us, I think, space to unpack that in a uniquely powerful way.
I would say gives you the language. Sorry, I was just going to say not even just gives you the language, but has the responsibility to foster those kind of gatherings. And I would say that to people who are listening who have congregations, it's a congregational responsibility to foster those gatherings. Yeah.
The congregation is a gathering of sorts, and the charge, I would think, is to find out, what does it mean to be in a because the tumultuous gathering, for me, again, like what else were two Negroes doing in the late 1890s other than planning and plotting freedom, right? And thinking about the history of Black liberation theology, and thinking about slave religion, or enslaved religion, liberation has yet to come. And congregations, well, this has been thrown into chaos, I would say, but congregations exist in places. There are social interactions in some form or fashion, and in this interaction, what the question that I think would be useful, Cody, would be, in these interactions, in the way that we occupy, the way that we live on the land, how can we live with the land? How can we live with one another in ways that do not continue anti-Black violence, indigenous violence, trans violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
How do we live less violently in the world? And I think that for congregations, for institutions, I think that's the question we have to be living with. But that requires a very hard look at the normals that we live. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Khalfani. We're coming towards the end of our time here, and I'll just go ahead and say to everybody and to you that Khalfani is going to be a recurring guest. We've got a lot to dive into here, so we're going to definitely have him back. But I mean, I think this question of, how do we live less violently in the world, and not surface level, like, how do we dive into having these the only way to be less violent in the world is to examine the history of violence in which white supremacy has perpetuated, capitalism and the story, the myth of the American project perpetuates, all these different kind of options, and not just how do we sit down and decide, I think we should be less violent today, but actually examining what are the structures and systems that prop up violence and that we're complicit in holding up, whether we're cognizant of it or not. Well, Khalfani, thank you so much for this, and you've given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your work. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to an episode of Coffee and Something Stronger.